This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Friday, March 20th, 2026. Several announcements were made this week regarding defense investments in the Arctic and the North, one of which was Prime Minister Mark Carney's announcement of a $35 billion federal plan to expand defense capabilities and infrastructure in Canada's North, including upgrades to military bases, new operational hubs, improved airports, and road construction projects. Much of the funding builds on earlier investments set aside under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau for modernization of NORAD. The projects are expected to roll out over the next decade and aim to strengthen year-round access and operational capacity across Arctic and northern regions. To analyze the significance of these new announcements and what they mean for Canada's Arctic security, and to set the record straight on the term Arctic sovereignty, I'm pleased to be joined once again by Major General Michel Lalumiere, Vice Chair for Air and Space at the Conference of Defense Associations, Dr. James Fergusson, former Director of the Centre for Defense and Security Studies, and Dr. Rob Huebert, CDA Institute Fellow and Director of the University of Calgary's Centre for Military, Strategic, and Security Studies. This is the Expert Series. First, we'll turn to Michel Lalumiere. We discussed upgrades to northern forward operating locations and why they matter, the role of infrastructure in Arctic defense, Canada's defense industrial base and supply chains, including ammunition and aerospace capacity, and sustaining public support for projects such as this, especially given cost of living pressures.
Michel, I'm wondering if you can pinpoint some of the most significant projects or investments that were outlined in some of these plans, and maybe you could touch on why we're seeing them now and maybe how they complement some of the investments we've seen over the past couple of years.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Josh. I think what gives me hope and comfort in the scale of recent announcements that Canadian heard is it stretches to address major reach of the defense gaps that we would have had to manage and balance over decades and decades and decades. Why do I describe it in such a manner is these announcements are to address our ability to really consider the entirety of our country, including airspace and the reach of our airspace. If we think of the entirety of the Canadian identification zone that has to be monitored and protected. The entirety of the maritime, let's call it the exclusive economic zone that has to be under our care, and that the Canadians would expect that is already under our care, with the means not only to understand what's going on in all the way to the corners and the limits of our sovereign territory, airspace and maritime areas as well, but also with the ability to address issues that would come up, that would rise from, the complete spectrum of security and defense, wouldn't it? All the way from a catastrophe at one end through criminality, if this is what's might be going on, and emerging events would require us to understand those a bit better, all the way to defense. We think there is an actual threat from another national entity, threatening our very nation, and then we have to defend it. So the recent announcements aims to reach those areas of our country that have always been so hard to reinforce, to equip, and the reasons for those have stayed the same because they are far at the corner, far if we think distance from our main centers of activities, so our main cities or where population is, or weather, right? So the environment, making it also hard to operate in those locations, or density. The density of our activities and our enablers are just not at those locations yet, as the nation is still evolving. Those recent announcements reaches that level of ambition and complexity, Josh. I think that's what makes those unique.
I also noticed in the announcements there was sections dedicated to NORAD's Northern Basing Infrastructure Program, upgrades being made to forward operating locations in Yellowknife, Inuvik, and Iqaluit. Could you maybe describe to our audience why upgrades like these or investments might be important for us as we, as you mentioned, do more to ensure that these vital domains of air and maritime are under our surveillance and that we're monitoring them effectively?
Yeah. I'm going to use one word that is so confusing. Infrastructure. As a French Canadian, I love this word because I'm always tempted to right away off the gate try to clarify with my interlocutor or in a conversation to say, what do you mean by infrastructure? So the recent announcements, I've enjoyed already building on a narrative that has spent a lot of time describing ambition on building infrastructure, in this case in particular, in the north. So it's tempting just to start to think of brick and mortar, right? So we're talking obviously here, infrastructure, buildings. So buildings where some of the activities that we're describing can be better understood, that they would be anchored and enabled by the required facility exists to enable these capabilities to be effective. And that includes, right off the bat, then we start thinking of the other infrastructure requirements that are immediately required, which then probably means ways to access those locations if they're not already very resilient or substantial. When we think of infrastructure, then immediately we start thinking of will we be able to access these locations maybe in a more efficient way, being by capacity or being by resiliency of methods to access these locations and operate from these locations. So we're thinking then, is it a port that we're going to be using to regularly come in and out of those locations? Is it going to be airports? Is the airport adequate? Is the airfield adequate to accommodate a large spectrum of traffic, air mobility traffic in this case, and so forth? So right away then, infrastructure, we start thinking of those initial aspects of infrastructure that we would imagine for those operating locations to make operating from those locations normal, to put it into that bracket, to make it more familiar with the way we operate from other locations, with, frankly, maybe down south, southern portions of Canada, we take for granted, right? This is what normal feels like. However, when we're talking defense capabilities, especially today's type of defense capabilities, infrastructure immediately brings another set of questions. To be able to operate at some of the level of integration that we need to operate to maintain the operational advantage against our adversary, then right away we're thinking of connectivity. Those new infrastructure locations will include the type of network, sophisticated network that we will require to fight with the type of capabilities that we are equipping the Canadian Armed Forces today. So that's the question that I have. I think this is what I'm reading in the very recent statements from the Canadian government, building on the previous NORAD modernization announcements that had been made a few years ago that still describes that path to the building of those infrastructures. And it's still the same word, infrastructure. So then I'm thinking, okay, it's about then networking. It's about the connectivity. It's about then making sure that the enablers from a defense capability perspective will also be at location and will be able to operate at the efficiency level that would be required for that defense capability to be effective and to be winning. Where I then get and find even more comfort, Josh, in the announcements that I just read, beyond the forward operating locations and the four that have been listed, Yellowknife, Inuvik, Iqaluit, and even Five Wing Goose Bay in Labrador. Suddenly I see a bridge of where defense starts to mix with security and definitely needs to anchor in national security. When I see announcements made that now qualifies government terminology, Canadian government terminology, in the category of major projects, this is where then I'm starting to read real intent to address national security in this country, specifically for that region. That really got me attentive. When I see words such as the Mackenzie Valley Highway, the Grays Bay Road and Port, to energize Arctic economy and security corridor, then I start to see this whole network of resiliency towards ensuring that northern capabilities being described here would be addressed in a way to make the resiliency at the national level.
It's interesting you say all this, you make all these points, Michel. I do note that something obviously at the forefront of everyone's minds right now is this push to 5% defense spending. I mean, Canada has been under 2% for some time. One would conceive that getting to 5% might have significant changes on Canadian society more broadly. So, many of these are infrastructure projects that seem to be kind of put under the banner of defense spending or security. Do you think that maybe perhaps because of this kind of fragmenting world order we find ourselves in, great power competition, has our concept of what constitutes, defense and security kind of changed if they're now starting to involve economic and infrastructure projects? Curious to hear your thoughts there.
I think it forced us to reflect on, do we have enough national security enablers to ensure we can maintain our defense capabilities? What is the defense capability today of Canadians that Canadians can count on? As soon as you start describing it, questions come to how long would it take to address this aspect that you just described, Canadian Armed Forces, that other aspect. Right away, that discussion then taps into what are the options to address such a defense capability, being our Navy, being our Air Force, the Army, and so forth, gets us to look inside our own Canadian sovereign defense industrial base. And I think this is what we can reflect on for this last year. I would say that our defense readiness, military readiness in this country required us to look at our defense industrial base capacity. And then we found definitely some choices that needed to be made. Do we have the industrial sector that we think we require, let's say, in our ability to source ammunition to the level that we would require it? Do we have enough, if we count on a supply chain to provide that to our armed forces? Do we have enough confidence that the supply chains that we've counted on for the last many years is resilient enough, and we have the proper access to it? Do we contribute enough to that worldwide supply chain? I use ammunition. You can take that word out and replace it by any other critical defense military enabler, or even core defense capability, and exercise that thought process, that analysis at the same level. Do we have enough aerospace industrial capacity within this country that we can tap into ourselves. Same thing for mobility on the land side, same thing for a maritime side. So to your question, Josh, a long way again to come back to it is these investments, can they really be labeled as defense, military, or more? And if that's the money associated with those investments and that work, or is it more towards industry, the industry itself, or the economy, the Canadian economy as a whole? Well, scholars that have a lot of experience in those themes and spheres and fields would tell you that national security first starts with the Canadian and national economy, doesn't it? In that resiliency that we have, and then builds into where is that economy very efficient. Where does it have its advantage? Where are the vulnerabilities? And when we go then into the defense sector itself, we just unpack it even further in that analysis. So these are still critical, considerations of this Canadian government as it's building on the road to 5% to also address our national industrial base to build it to a level that is adequate to the mandate that our Canadian Armed Forces have to defend this country, but also meets the commitments that we've made to our very allies, right? That Canada will be there in a very reliable way.
Michel, I want to touch on something that you brought up actually just before we started recording that I think is very interesting and sort of fits part of our mandate of educating the public as a think tank. I think one might make the argument that over the past 5 to 10 years, interest in defense has gradually perhaps increased a little bit as we've seen some of these breakdowns in what one might call the global security framework or order, maybe starting with the Ukraine war, COVID. I think it might be safe to make the argument, at least, that following President Trump's remarks last year about Canada becoming the 51st state, there was probably a bit of a spike of interest in defense and security matters, making some of these kinds of spending announcements perhaps a bit more politically palpable or popular even. That said, I mean, we still live in a time of relatively high inflation. The economy is not doing so well, perhaps in some sectors. Then there is the threat of tariffs and the impact of that on the economy. When we see an announcement that's $35 to $40 billion from the governments, and Canadians are also at the same time dealing with the cost of living crisis, how much can these kinds of investments that are necessary in defense be sustained, and how can we maybe maintain the public's support, I guess? So there's a couple of questions in there. I'm sure if we had the answers to them, they would not be problems, but I'm curious to hear what you think of this.
Josh, I think you've got your finger exactly on the priority question. Is in our country, the decision starts very much at every single individual, at every Canadian, and they think of their country security. Some will call it national security. It starts with local security and individual security. And that's why I think in this shock, worldwide shock, but also this country's shock, that we can look back 1 year and then a couple of years further back, and then all the way 2 more years to COVID. These shocks always enable the Canadians to ask themselves that question. What is my vulnerability, or the main vulnerabilities that right now are putting us individually or as a nation into this moment where we have to make an important decision that will have ripple effects on our economy of today, and then how will we get back to prosperity? So and therefore investment. So I think Canadians thought for the last, I'm going to be ambitious here, I'm going to say 12 months, which is hard to get anybody to think that long on one category of topics. But if the Canadians had to think largely about security, including or starting with its economic security over the last 12 months, because suddenly we saw our economy being vulnerable for multiple reasons. Therefore, what are the measures to make our economy more resilient? So our economy, therefore, ensuring that jobs that we have in this country and our expectations of having access to the job market is also resilient. We can count on it. We can start planning economically, individually, but also at a business level, our industry and so forth, to remain resilient and to protect ourselves, right? To not manage risk, but address those risk areas where we no longer feel comfortable that was a sound posture to have. That's what has occurred in the last 12 months. It started at that level, and some would claim that finally we're thinking in this country at the national security level. I'm not going to put a label on it. I'm just happy that the Canadians and ourselves, myself as well, we are thinking at this larger level. Therefore, where are we going to be investing? When I see the announcements, then going from that macro level down to what is the average Canadian, to your question, thinking about specific large investments, even at the infrastructure level, maybe with a label of defense on it. My argument, you've heard me saying before, I think it goes further than just defense. This is national security level. What is the average Canadian thinking of this? Hopefully, Canadians are thinking not so much about the destination, but our ability to become really good as Canadians to tackle these major projects. So if now the optic is pivoting us to the north and saying we're going to do also these major projects, opening up our ability to have better lines of communications to the north, with sound economic corridor to the north, with the electrical grids in the north to support activities, economic activities being whatever they are. I think Canadians will see themselves in it, and probably as a priority. It's not so much the destination, is it? Okay, let's all pull together. We're going to build, we're going to expand this port. We're going to expand this highway. We're going to expand this airport. It's not so much the destination, but I think it's the ability to not only get back to it, because we have been really good at doing those things before, but how come we stopped? So it's putting in place, hopefully now, and I think that's the question, some sort of irreversible momentum into getting back to being really good at it and never stopping again. So never stopping at this ecosystem that we need to become really comfortable in building these infrastructure, and only when these infrastructure then become available, never stopping, ensuring that they stay available. And then we address the next geographical, if it's what it is, and address that to the same level, and then return and maintain. And so creating the ecosystem with the trades and the know-how and the ability and the capacity, I think, is the objective. Not so much the ultimate aim and then call it, this is a project completed finally, and we can stop and then move back to whatever it was that we were doing before. It's about the ecosystem, not so much a deliverable.
We'll now turn to Jim Fergusson, who touches on modernizing northern forward operation locations, the overlap between NORAD modernization, defense policy, and Arctic development, Canada-U.S. defense cooperation, and follow-through risks of projects like this, including costs, logistics, and pressures on northern and Indigenous communities.
So as you'll well know, Prime Minister Carney announced a series of investments for Arctic and northern security. I'm wondering if within those $35 to $40 billion investments, you can unpack for us what you thought were maybe the most interesting or impactful, and why the announcement's coming now. And maybe within that, you can provide some context for how we got here, because in the past few years, there's been several Arctic investments, as well as a foreign policy that was released.
Well, a lot of it goes back to 2022 and the NORAD modernization announcements, first by the Minister of National Defense, Anita Anand, and then the month later in July, more details provided by the Department of National Defense on what the projects were. If we think to the most recent announcements from the Prime Minister, it becomes a bit unclear what is part of NORAD modernization, what is part of Canadian defense modernization, because they are interlinked with one another. And thirdly, of course, the issues surrounding investments in northern and Arctic development for the Indigenous communities. So trying to unpack that is not an easy thing. So if you think about some of the investments that are going into, for example, into roads and other things in the Arctic, which have some peripheral value to NORAD, and then on the other hand, the development investments that are planned for the forward operating locations to bring them up to a modernized state to be able to deal with the new capabilities which the Canadian Armed Forces are acquiring. Those are very important. They include the ability to deploy the F-35 into the north, the Husky refueling capability into the north, the Canadian AWACS airborne warning and control system into the north. These all create a significant burden on the Indigenous communities and capabilities up there. So it's very difficult to understand exactly how this was fit out. And then at the end of the day, the other big issue is, because we've seen this before over time, whether the Canadian government will actually follow through with all these commitments.
Would you be able to chat about in what ways, if any, some of these announcements will help move the dial a bit on NORAD modernization? I see in the announcement that there's investments going toward forward-looking bases and other hubs and nodes throughout the North and the Arctic. Will this contribute to our readiness, if you will?
Well, it should. Again, if we follow through with all these investments. The 3 forward operating locations, Inuvik, I can never remember the names of them. In the north, Yellowknife, Nanisivik, and related to Goose Bay, will be very important for deployment in the case of a crisis against particularly Russian-derived threats to the continent. There's also investments being made in Rankin Inlet, which was a former forward operating location, which again will be very important for the distribution of more resources into the Arctic. But the question becomes, how are you going to deal with this, particularly in the context of reconciliation and in Indigenous, the Inuit communities and local communities? Because all this construction that is going to go on is all, by and large, given the short construction season in the Arctic and the North, is going to come from the South. And that's going to create a significant burden on those local communities, which have their own problems in terms of water supply, waste management, housing, et cetera, et cetera. So announcements are nice. Governments love announcements. But when to use the old phrase, when the rubber hits the road, we'll see how this all plays itself out.
Jim, do you have any faith that the government will follow through with some of the plans detailed in this announcement? Do you think there's a political optics element, or?
Well, there is a political optics element, although one wonders about the political rationale, given these are small populations and isolated communities, and how significant they are in the real politics of Canada is a different question. Follow through is an interesting question because it's not just the threat environment that we live in today, particularly focused to a lesser degree on China, but certainly on Russia. It's also the economy. It's also the deficit and the debt. And we can't predict how the international environment may suddenly change in us, because it changes suddenly many times, much to our surprise. And the economic world, in terms of government spending, becomes another potential obstacle to follow through. And I think it's important to remember in this regard that all the estimates the government gives you about all these projects are never accurate. They're usually underestimated, and prices will escalate. So whether the government will have the resources to follow through is an important question. But there are certainly areas where they have no choice but to follow through, and that's certainly in the particular areas of NORAD modernization. That's vital for the defense of Canada and North America.
I'm hoping we can unpack some of the language that was in the statement a bit as well that was interesting to me. We had, and I believe I quote, Canada's moving from reliance to resilience, so that word reliance, and we will no longer depend on any one nation and instead build a stronger, more independent country. With this new plan, Canada is taking full responsibility for defending our Arctic sovereignty. So on one hand, this week we had Carney traveling to Norway, and there was, I believe, a joint announcement between Norway and Canada. So I guess on one hand, is there room for some of the Nordic allies to collaborate with Canada more when it comes to Arctic security? On the other hand, is this kind of pointed or influenced by our relationship with the United States and the U.S. president as of late? The reliance,
Primarily, it's related to our relationship with the United States over the tariff issue and the economic question with the United States and other issues regarding so-called perceptions of the reliability of the American commitment. Canada does not have to worry about the reliability of the American commitment for the defense of North America with us. This is nice political optics, in my view. Norway, the Nordic countries, and not just them, and the discussions that Prime Minister has had, and the agreements we've signed with them, the European Union, Britain, the Asian Pacific partners, South Korea and Japan, are all nice, but they're just simply divorced from reality. The Nordic countries, Norway is the closest to us because they face similar problems given where they reside in the North Atlantic into the Arctic Circle. But again, they have different problems as the Finns and the Swedes do, much different strategic situation than we do. And we haven't really, and again, one should not misunderstand me. We live with North America. We live with the United States. The defense of Canada depends upon the United States as the defense of the United States depends upon Canada. So the political optics are nice, but in reality, managing the relationship with the United States is the most important strategic priority for Canada.
Jim, you and I have spoken about this very topic a couple times on the podcast, so hopefully you don't mind retreading some older ground, but I'm keeping a new audience in mind who might just be tuning in. Now, despite the challenges or tensions, even if you want to call them that, in the current bilateral relationship, are you then of the sort of belief that no matter what happens, Canada and America have a vested interest to cooperate on continental defense, and that is going to likely continue regardless of who the head of state is or who is occupying a certain cabinet position?
Exactly. One of the great things about our defense relationship with the United States is it's always operated, by and large, politically under the radar. Neither the United States, for a variety of its own reasons, being a global superpower, and Canada, for its own reason, like to talk about it. We don't say a lot about the relationship. We keep it quiet. And when we think of the tensions in the economic relationship with the United States and how it's impacted upon our alliance relationships with NATO, etc., what is missed in all this is that direct cooperation between the Canadian and the American military, particularly in NORAD, continues without a problem. And that will continue for both countries because it's functionally in the self-interest of both of us to continue this. So we might get upset about President Trump's recent annexation of Greenland threat. But again, it's not that significant at all at the day. Everyone got upset, But in fact, I wondered why are we getting all excited about this? Because it's not going to happen. We know it's not going to happen, and everything will sort of work itself out quietly. The government doesn't want to talk about this because of the political climate in Canada. And I understand that entirely. And we all understand that. But in the defense side of the world, we don't have many options. And that's the only option.
I don't want to get on too much of a tangent or aside here, Jim, but if I could ask, and it's been asked a million times, and there's a lot of different opinions on the matter, but is there a strategy when President Trump says these things, or do you think Mr. Trump just has a certain way of communicating or carrying on that is kind of organic and that has ramifications on the international system?
Well, you're right. He has a certain way of carrying on. He has no filter. He is, in my view, impulsive. And I've said to a lot of people, stop listening to him, because he bounces around all over the place. Look at what the Americans are doing, and if you look at exactly what they're doing, and although there are deep concerns in the United States, which have been around for decades, about their commitment to the Europeans, and more importantly, the Europeans' commitment to the United States, those things are important to consider. But at the end of the day, American policy really hasn't significantly changed at all. The rhetoric under Trump has changed, and it bounces all over. So as I said, stop listening to him. Look at what the Americans are doing. Look at their investments. Look at their decisions. And there's not a lot of great difference between previous administrations and the current administration. Trump needs a filter. He's undiplomatic, he's crude, but in many ways, that's what makes him popular in the United States.
It is indeed. Now, you mentioned that the rubber needs to hit the road. An announcement is great. There's been lots of announcements, and I think you're echoing what several other observers and experts have said. Let's wait and see and put their money where their mouths are. The investment announcements are great, Jim, but if Canada is to continue on this project of securing the Arctic more, safeguarding its sovereignty, quote unquote, as some have said, what are some additional, maybe near or shorter term investments or how can I put it? What are some sort of more immediate actions that could be taken to embark on that stated objective, I would say?
Well, the first thing I would say to you, and I know this dominance of the concept of sovereignty, which is misapplied and misunderstood in the context of the Canadian North and the Arctic. There are no sovereignty threats to us up there, period. The most impressing things that we have is to make final decisions about where we're going. The F-35 issue, the fighter replacement issue, has got to be decided. It's time the government, I won't use bad language, but they decided to put an end to this and put it to bed. They need to invest. A lot of the northern, I can't remember what the government calls it, the northern basing hubs, support hubs, and all these things and other things that he announced in earlier March, a week ago, I think, are all look good for Indigenous development, Inuit and development, community development, and access to the South. Everything is wonderful there. But in the defense of Canada, those are not a priority to defense. The priority of defense is to get on with what they've identified as NORAD modernization, to invest in the forward operating locations, the infrastructure for the bases, Cold Lake and Bagotville. Those are the priorities right now. To signal, particularly to the United States, that we're serious about this. We're going to do something. Because otherwise, if we delay this or drag it out, the problem that's going to happen to Canada is the United States is going to take unilateral decisions about how they're going to deal with this. And that's not in our interests at all.
To close out the episode, we turn to Rob Huebert, and our discussion focuses on the gap between government announcements and actual follow-through, uncertainty around key military capabilities, especially the fighter replacement and its impact on basing decisions, and the shifting threat environment and strategic mindset, including Russia-China risks, and the need for long-term policy change.
So, Rob, the announcement argues that or mentions that previous governments lacked quote unquote scale and breadth. What assumptions about past Arctic policy or investments are underpinned within that? And is this kind of, I guess, critique, if you want to call it that, justified?
Yeah, well, the problem with, of course, if we look at what governments have actually done as opposed to what they've said, we'll see that the record is awful. Two examples stand out. The first one, of course, is the ongoing agony to build a new icebreaker. That was first promised in Parliament by Joe Clark in September 10th, 1985, and it takes until 1922 or until 2022 before we actually start building it. And the more recent example, of course, is Strong, Secure, and Engaged back in 2017. It included several comments and several promises about Arctic security, including the issue surrounding NORAD modernization. And of course, everybody was all excited because the government of the day then said it was fully costed. That made it different from anything that went before it. And of course, in reality, it wasn't anything different from anything else because we never spent any of that money until we start getting into the second phase of the Ukrainian war in 2022. So again, it's not uncommon for a government to say, look, we're going to do it so different from everyone else before us. And then, of course, time and time again, we see that they don't do it.
Rob, do you think you might be able to unpack what some of the more significant funding announcements or projects appear to be based on the announcement from earlier this week?
Well, again, and we've always done this, we always conflate the expenditures that absolutely are necessary in terms for the North. So we see a lot of the promises that Carney is making right now for the improvement of the infrastructure in the North. And we see kind of talks about war, improving roads. We see, in fact, elements of going some types of infrastructure in some of the forward operating location. But what that ultimately means is that the stuff that we also have to be doing, which of course is the money going into the forward operating, forward-looking radars and other such related purely military stuff, we often raise these expectations that, look, we're spending $38 billion on defense, when in fact that we're not really spending it on defense. We're spending it on infrastructure. We're spending it for the welfare of the Arctic region, but it's not defense, because notice they never said anything in that statement about any monies going in terms of the decision related to the future fighter replacements for the F-18, nothing about the submarines. And so once again, it raises this sort of sense that, oh, look at the government doing all this stuff on Arctic security, when in fact it is Arctic industrial policy, it is Arctic infrastructure, which then allows the government to say, well, we don't have to spend any more. And that's where the danger starts coming in.
From your perspective, Rob, did the announcement move the dial at all when it comes to NORAD modernization? I see that there's announcements for northern basing infrastructure. I'm wondering to what extent that might contribute towards those efforts.
Well, of course, it raises the question. They're saying we are going to be improving the infrastructure in the forward operating locations, but we don't know what aircraft we need to be designing that for. The requirements for the Griffin is very different than the requirements for the F-35s. The F-35s require a security level, as our Norwegian allies have been telling us, as the Danes and Finns are expecting, that is of a very different level than what the Griffin requires. And so, okay, you're going to put in an infrastructure. You say that you're going to be improving the basis for the aerospace side of what you need to do, but how are you actually supposed to do that when you don't exactly know what aircraft you have? Yes, we're getting the first 15 or so of the F-35s, but it's still up in the air for the remainder aircraft right now. And so that becomes an important element of sort of putting the horse before the cart in this regards.
That announcement builds on previous government investments in defense, infrastructure, northern development, and a couple announcements that have come out in the past year or two, as well as an Arctic foreign policy statement. Do you think that this newest announcement builds upon those or complements them at all?
Well, we see that there is that effort to try to ensure that the NORAD modernization is included. The challenge that the government has now, and this is one that is indeed a really important challenge, is given the actions of the Trump administration in the second term, it makes it very difficult for the government to do what it normally would do, which is to say, we're doing this in lockstep with the Americans, we're working closely with the Americans, and in effect making NORAD as seamless as possible in this increasingly dangerous international environment. But of course, any effort to tie yourself to working with the Trump administration, given some of the very dangerous statements that he's made regarding Canada and annexation, becomes difficult. And so we see in this context the Canadian government very clearly trying to send a signal that it is actually working with others rather than the Americans. But we come back to the reality that to have a proper seamless capability in North America, particularly given the growing sophistication of the missiles, Poseidon, and other delivery systems that the Russians are now advancing, you've got to be working for the Americans. And so, we're watching a little bit difference in terms of Carney at least trying to signal, well, we're really doing this with the Australians, we're doing this with the Norwegians, and then trying to figure out how you then realize, though, that you still have to be doing it with the Americans. And that's the difference. At least in political tone, it's very different. What's happening behind the scenes, of course, you and me aren't simply going to be privy to. It's very possible that we are seeing continued good relations with the Americans behind the scenes, or it is entirely possible that Trump has really poisoned that well for the time being.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask about that, Rob. I mean, the statement said something along the lines of, we will no longer depend on any one nation. We'll build a stronger, more independent country. We're moving from reliance to resilience. How might a more, self-reliant Arctic posture affect Canada's relationship with the United States? And then, maybe separately, do you think the Americans are going to look at this new tranche of investments, and do you think that might make them happy? Like, oh, Canada is taking further steps to try and secure its north.
Well, I think it really depends on which of the Americans are looking at it. We've seen that anything in terms of sort of its own self-interest at the highest level doesn't seem to matter, because, I mean, we look at what's happening in Iran right now. We see Trump and his most senior advisors seemingly surprised that after all the negativity that they've heaped upon their allies, that no one is jumping to join them in the war against Iran. And you see this astonishment in their eyes. They're like, how do you not like us anymore? Is there like, you think? Now, again, we have to believe that below the immediate top level, that in fact more intelligent, more intelligent leadership is still trying to maintain the relationship with the allies, and that presumably would include us. That in fact that the Americans below the senior administration understands that the protection of North America has to be done seamlessly between Canada and the United States. And so, again, I'm a little bit, let's wait and see in terms of these statements that we're going to be independent, because we, first and foremost, will never be independent. We don't have the capability of being independent from the aerospace side. I mean, how do we get, we've always lied in terms of maintaining RadarSat. It's a great system. But are you really going to try and tell me that Canada is now going to develop its own surveillance satellite systems? And so the stuff that at least remains out of the public eye, I think that we're probably still working very closely with the Americans at this point in time. First and foremost, we're still going to have the two major adversaries that we identified in both the Canadian Arctic foreign policy and the update to the defense policy. And that's the Russians first and foremost, and then the Chinese. Of course, now we have to add the uncertainty that the Americans have created in that context. The other part that comes in, and this sort of came out in the Hogue report, even though it was somewhat muted in actually bringing it to the forefront, but we do have at least 5 countries, and we probably can add the Americans to it, that are actively making political moves to try to undermine our political system. And I mean, that is the Russians, Chinese again. But we also have the Iranians, the Pakistanis, and the Indians. And so as we see this uncertainty in Canadian policy, or at least this move to try to protect ourselves from some of the statements and actions that the Trump is doing, there's no question that some of these other players will be trying to cause even further damage to that relationship. And so Canada's in this very difficult situation of really not spending anything on our northern capabilities, only really starting to invest after the second phase of the Ukrainian war back in 2022. We have all this catching up to do, and we have a very fluid enemy environment that we are facing. And so it's really not so much what Canada spends in one overall sort of go out and say, we're going to build a road, but in fact that we have to have a different mindset, that we have to realize that we are no longer protected by the oceans that surround us and ultimately living next to the Americans. And I think that the most important response we have for meeting these very difficult threat environment now is to ensure that we don't have prime ministers that think they solve Arctic sovereignty by a statement at the beginning of their term and then moving on to domestic concerns. This has to be a new way of thinking at the very senior level, and that requires a very different strategic cultural shift within Canada that we probably haven't seen since the Second World War.
I'm wondering if you might be able to reiterate some of the most consequential investments from the announcement, and then maybe you could explain to what extent you think it moves the needle on Arctic security. And then following on that, maybe you could explain to us what you think still needs to happen in the maybe short to immediate term, how the government can keep building on this announcement to further secure the region before we wrap up.
Sure. One of the critical things that we see with the promises, particularly with the improved basing capability, if it is directed to the aerospace capabilities of Canada and the maritime side, then that, of course, provides for an improvement in Canadian Arctic security, because the threat is an aerospace and maritime threat, both coming mainly from the Russians, but also we expect going into the future, that's where it would be coming from the Chinese. There's a little bit of a, once again, we have to wait to see where the money actually is going to be spent. But if you take the announcements at face value, there almost seems to be a emphasis on improving Canada's land-based and land force capabilities in there. The North is not going to be physically invaded. There's never been an actual fear that the Soviets/Russians or the Chinese are going to all of a sudden appear in amphibious capabilities and invade any of these locations, except for the possibility of maybe special forces taking some of our radar sites, alert and such. So as long as we are not going to be seeing the government saying, well, we've got to get boots on the ground, and that's the important thing, as opposed to saying we have to ensure that the radar systems, the surveillance systems that we are putting in to guard for the aerospace threat are in fact the emphasis. That the emphasis is also making sure that the maritime approaches to the North American continent are protected, and all investment is there to support that. As long as that's the element of the investment that comes forward, that's moving in the right direction. If we start just, though, however, saying we've got to bunker down and be prepared for an invasion, then that's a misappropriation of the funding. And again, reading the announcements, I think that it could go either way, because you could use the particularly for the forward offering locations, the infrastructure, the basing there to protect that. If it's for the protection of whatever fighter we do get for the refueling tankers, then it's a step in the right direction. But if it's just simply saying, okay, we've got more land forces there, we're better protected, then that takes us, I think, in the wrong direction. I think the thought I would want to leave on is Canada's history when it comes to Arctic security is one of great announcements. We are very good, and we see this in both sides of the political spectrum. We're very good for making these sweeping statements and saying that we've solved Arctic security, and then moving on and not doing anything. The threat environment has become so dangerous that that is no longer sufficient. We clearly need to have a changing of how we think about this threat so that it is not just simply, okay, I've issued, from a prime ministerial perspective, I've issued a statement and policy, we're good, we're done, let's move on. But rather, this has to be an ongoing response. If it is indeed an ongoing response, and Carney seems to be suggesting that this is what he wants to do, then of course we can say, okay, so we are starting to get ready to deal with the threat. But if it's just simply, hey, I've solved it, I'm going to move on to other issues, then again, we're just going to be replicating bad habits that we've had in the past.
And that's all for today's episode. The Expert Series is released every Friday. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email josh@cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.